Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at the Bermuda Triangle, but we're not just looking at it as a spot on a map. Nope, we're using it as a really fascinating case study in how we as humans literally build mysteries out of incomplete information. You probably already know the legend, planes vanishing, ships swallowed whole. But today, we're going to separate the dramatic story from the actual mechanics at play to build a really wholesome understanding of the whole topic. So before we get into the weeds, let's just address the elephant in the room, right? The Bermuda Triangle is almost always framed around one giant question. Does something supernatural happen there? But honestly, that framing kind of completely hides the real issue. We need to pivot to much better, much more useful questions. Like, what actually occurred out there? How unusual were these events compared to any other stretch of ocean? And why on earth did this specific area become the ultimate symbol of maritime mystery?
Okay, Section 1, the real Bermuda mystery.
Let's think about how stories, uncertainty, and actual real-world risks get all mixed up together until a pattern feels way, way larger than the evidence actually supports. Think of it like a busy old bazaar. When a bunch of people describe the exact same corner of that market at different times, each story might be entirely true in its own little way. But as people repeat those stories over and over, the exciting details just get louder and louder. Pretty soon, you're not hearing about raw individual events anymore. You're hearing an organized narrative that's practically structuring the events for you. Basically, a few real incidents, repeated often enough, turn into a legend that just sort of seems to explain itself.
Moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of a Legend.
To really peel back the psychological layer of this whole legend, imagine you find a cracked cup sitting in your kitchen. Now, the crack itself, that's a real fact. It's right there. But that crack alone doesn't tell you if the cup was dropped, if someone heated it up too fast, or if it just had a tiny invisible flaw from the very beginning. The object gives you the end result, but it literally cannot give you the full history of how it got there.
And that brings us to a super crucial point. An event is absolutely not the same thing as a cause. A strange event, like a vanishing ship, is a fact, but the cause, that's an explanation. And making the huge leap from an unusual event straight to some supernatural force, well, that's a leap the available evidence almost never actually supports. Legends thrive because they start with a completely real fact and then just kind of smuggle in a dramatic, completely unproven cause. Which brings us to this really fascinating quirk of human psychology. We are absolute pattern-finding machines, even when the pattern is super weak. Imagine dropping 3 coins on the floor over the course of a month, and just by total coincidence, they all land near each other in the same corner. Your brain is going to start noticing that spot. We are hardwired to see shapes and patterns first, because evolutionarily, it helps us survive. But sometimes that clustering is just coincidence. Once the Bermuda Triangle got its catchy name, totally separate, unrelated incidents suddenly started looking like pieces of one giant, unified phenomenon. The label itself literally became a magnet. But see, comparison changes the whole game. When we actually compare the triangle to other heavily traveled ocean routes, we see that busy places naturally just generate more incidents. The Bermuda Triangle sits in a super heavily traveled part of the world. It's exactly like how a crowded, bustling marketplace is naturally going to have way more lost wallets than an empty, quiet field. A busy ocean zone means more ships, more exposure to crazy weather, and naturally just way more opportunities for error. Plus, there's this wild trick our memory plays on us. Think of it like this. It is exactly like remembering the one single time a tea glass shattered in your hands, while completely forgetting the literally hundreds of times it safely held your drink. If you only ever judged the glass based on that one broken moment, you'd think it was constantly fragile and dangerous, right? The legend survives almost entirely on what we call selected memory. A disappearance makes a massive, dramatic headline because it's packed with emotional force and terrifying uncertainty. Meanwhile, total memory, meaning the thousands upon thousands of totally ordinary, completely safe passages across the Atlantic every single year, just vanishes into the background. Why? Because normal simply doesn't make the evening news. Furthermore, good explanations have to compete with alternatives. When you're trying to explain a missing plane, a mysterious, supernatural cause has to compete with very ordinary ones, like bad weather, human error, or just running out of fuel. It's honestly just like diagnosing a broken phone. You check the battery, you look for water damage, you check the hardware way before you'd ever assume invisible, magical forces broke it. The simpler explanation is usually tested first because, well, it actually makes contact with reality.
All right, Section 3, the chain of risk.
Let's pivot for a second to what is actually happening out there on the water. Scientists know that a disappearance is rarely ever just one single isolated bad event. Instead, it's way more like a row of falling dominoes, where different vulnerabilities just overlap. Step 1. The weather changes incredibly quickly. Step 2. Navigation becomes super uncertain. Step 3. A rescue gets delayed because the location is just incredibly remote. Now, any one of these things on its own is usually survivable, but when they stack up together, they completely erase any margin for error.
Scientists tend to look at this through systems thinking. They see how severe, incredibly fast-changing weather can totally overwhelm navigation systems. They factor in the historical difficulty of using older navigation tools, way back before GPS was even a thing. And, crucially, they look at human decision-making under intense uncertainty, like a captain deciding to push forward into a storm instead of turning back. The ocean doesn't just test our machines, it intensely tests our decisions.
Let's ground this with a totally different, maybe more local comparison. Imagine a delivery truck goes missing on a really long route in Pakistan. And let's say it happened because of a late departure, terrible visibility, and a sudden mechanical issue. Now, if evidence is totally scarce, people might start inventing a wild, dramatic explanation. But the real answer? It's entirely mundane. It only looks supernatural after the fact, simply because that ordinary chain of causes is totally hidden from us. So when you actually lay all these factors out, you get this really fantastic aha moment about how interacting risks literally build the myth. The weather creates a sudden intense danger. Human error comes in and compounds those mistakes. Mechanical failures wipe out safety margins. Weak historical records leave these gaping holes in the data. And then storytelling? That turns those empty gaps into a full-blown legend. The triangle essentially just bundles all these separate uncertainties into one neat, clean stage for a very messy reality. Okay, bringing us to Section 4, Thinking Like an Investigator. We are right at the hinge here between folklore and real analysis. See, legend thinking jumps straight from a vivid, exciting story to a special cause, saying, wow, something crazy happened there, so the place itself must be magical. But evidence thinking, that demands that we compare contexts. It says, okay, something happened there. Now we actually need to compare causes and see if the data genuinely earns the mystery. By actively separating the event from the cause and separating a loose pattern from actual proof, you gain an incredibly powerful tool. It protects you from getting pulled in by sheer drama and sensational storytelling, but it also ensures you don't just dismiss real-world dangers too quickly. You aren't just becoming skeptical for the fun of it. You are literally becoming an investigator who actively looks for the hidden chains of reality. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought, and I want you to apply this to literally any viral claim or urban legend you encounter next. Just ask yourself, are you just reacting to a really clean, entertaining story, or are you actually looking for the hidden chain of totally ordinary events? Because honestly, once you start seeing the real mechanism behind the myth, it kind of changes how you think about everything. Thanks so much for exploring this with us today, and remember to keep asking the right questions.